Well, welcome everybody to Apiculture Online, Hive Chat with NC State. We really appreciate everybody being here today, and we really appreciate having Dr. Mark Carroll from the USDA-ARS lab in Tucson, Arizona, who's our special guest interviewer. This is going to be the last Apiculture Online that we're going to do for this season, and we'll see if we will resume next season. We'll probably send out some questionnaires and flyers to see if this is something that you guys would like to continue, and suggestions for topics and everything else. But this has been really good during this kind of social distancing pandemic, and hopefully the traction on our YouTube channel has certainly increased monumentally. So we really appreciate everybody subscribing to our channel, liking and commenting on it. It really helps to provide that that sense of community that we're kind of lacking right now. I also realize I just want to kind of mention that, you know, the country and everything, there's so many bigger things that are going on right now than beekeeping, right? So in the greater scope of things, you know, beekeeping is fun, and for, you know, everybody who's not a commercial beekeeper, right? And the most beekeepers out there. But if this can serve as a little bit of a relief from some of those heavier and weightier issues, and to just focus on something that is fun and interesting, that's what this really serves. So there's plenty of other stuff that you can go onto YouTube and occupy your time with. But to talk about bees and beekeeping, I think that's a fun evening to have. So we'll go ahead and start, as we normally do, with our very first segment, the topic being bees in season, which is in essence, what are your bees doing right now? And as a result, what you should be doing as a beekeeper to help them during this time of year, to set them up for the next month or so. And the past several webinars that we've been having, we've been talking about getting your bees ready for winter and what bees do during winter. Well, winter certainly hasn't come, at least in our neck of the woods. So, you know, the idea that the bees are engaged in winter is kind of way premature. It was, you know, 80 degrees last week. So this varies tremendously depending on where you are. Now, it is getting colder nights, and, you know, the temperatures are kind of finally dropping. And of course, we can't predict how long the winter or how cold the winter is going to be, and neither can the bees. All they can do is respond to what they're sensing right now. So, you know, because it hasn't been a very kind of quick and cold start to the kind of winter dearth, it's very possible that in many areas the bees are still rearing brood. And if it is 80 degrees or in the 70s and the bees are flying, and you, especially if you see them carrying back pollen, it's a good idea that you might want to go in and check to see how much brood they still have. Are they brooding down? Is that brood nest within the colony kind of decreasing and they're backfilling it with pollen and honey like they should? Or are they just still kind of going gangbusters with brood? That gives you an indication of what they're going to look like about 3 to 6 weeks from now. One thing to be very careful, you know, during the kind of winter season is not to go in just willy-nilly, right? You don't want to go into your colonies whenever, especially when it's cold, because they need time to reseal all the cracks and crevices. Every time that you go in and you break two brood boxes apart, or you move some frames around, they want to go back in and seal all that stuff back up with propolis, especially for the winter, to keep the heat inside, so that they don't lose heat through these kind of holes in the roof, right? So if you are going to go in and inspect your colonies, which hopefully you're not doing too much, hopefully you've already set them up for success right now, but make sure that there's several days of forecast where it's going to be warm enough where they're going to go out and be able to collect some tree resins and bring them back and reseal those cracks. But otherwise, let's assume that winter is going to come, that, the bees are kind of going to go into that kind of quasi hibernation stage, and you're not going to be actively doing anything in hive, right? So, what are some of the kind of non in hive chores or things that you can do with beekeeping? And there is no downtime for the beekeeper. But it's really best to do your winter work during the winter and not leave it to the summer. So, what do I mean by that? Well, the winter is the best time. I shouldn't say winter preparation, should be winter activities. Um, One thing is to get working on that equipment, right? Build new equipment, repair kind of used or old or kind of broken equipment, repaint hives, all of that kind of stuff. Winter is a really great time to do it, because if you need next spring, you need to go out and your bees are about to swarm and you need to split them, and all of a sudden you don't have an extra brood box, that's a really bummer time to have to bang one together, right? So kind of think ahead, and kind of start making that equipment or repairing that equipment during the winter. And similarly, frames. Uh, one of the real keys to being on top of things as a beekeeper in the spring, when things are crazy busy and they're growing, and you even need to kind of deter their growth to keep them from swarming, is to have frames of foundation. And especially if you're making your own frames and you're not buying them fabricated, putting those frames together right now and having 3, 4, 5 boxes of foundation frames of foundation that are just ready to go, either individually or an entire box at a time, onto colonies to accommodate for those colony growth phases. That's really, really helpful. It's really tough to put together a whole lot of frames on the fly right in the busy season. Another thing to do during the winter is to brush up on your notes. And what I mean by that is every good beekeeper takes really good, careful notes of what they've done to each colony and when. And then being able to track that colony over time to see if something happened, you might be able to trace back and see, well, what did I do, 2 months earlier that might have, precipitated that particular problem. If you aren't taking notes, which unfortunately a lot of beekeepers don't do, then start. It is one of the number one things that beekeepers can do to improve their craft is taking better and well articulated notes, or using something like Hive Tracks. We had a apiculture online several times ago that talks about computer systems that are able to track what you're doing to your colonies. But whatever it is, look through your notes and learn from your mistakes, because all beekeepers make them, and see what works, see what doesn't, so that you can kind of refine and learn from your own history. I think that's really, really important. A fourth thing to do is to curl up with a good book. The winter time is a great time to, really advance your own understanding and knowledge about bees and beekeeping. And there are just so many great books out there about bees and beekeeping. And really push yourself, really kind of go into new areas. If you've never done any queen rearing, but you're kind of intrigued by it, read a book about queen rearing and see if that's something that you want to do. Or just get a different perspective by reading beekeeping in Australia or something like that, just to see kind of how different people do the same thing, right? So I think it's just really helpful um, to think outside of your own operation and get different and good ideas from different sources. And then finally, along the same lines of kind of educating yourself and staying on top of these things, is that our lives have gone viral and gone virtual and online, and so is beekeeping education. And so our program has the Bees Network, Beekeeper Education and Engagement System, where we have all these series of mini courses and even bundled courses if you want to take 3 at a time at a discount. There's lots of other YouTube and other information that's online. And so, go ahead and educate yourself. It's going to be a tricky year this kind of winter and spring, not knowing exactly how bee schools are going to run. So, a lot of them are going to go virtual, but these are things that you can do on your own individually or with a group. So it's just, again, something to think about educating yourself more formally with some of these beekeeping classes. So again, whatever you're doing right now, you're trying to prepare your bees for success 1 to 2 brood cycles from now, which is, 3 to 6 weeks. And, this is kind of the same advice that we've been giving the last few webinars here, because, they're going down, they're brooding down and going into the kind of off season. So you want to be fairly hands off. Hopefully you've set them up for success, so you don't need to go into them very often. So don't be nosy, take faith in yourself, but be vigilant. On warm days, keep checking for their flight activity, and on colder days, don't go into the hives, but you can just kind of, knock on the side of the hive and see if the cluster is buzzing in there, and make sure that everything's okay. If you have any dead outs, remove them from the apiary before things warm up, and they might get robbed out and spread disease and other things like that. So hopefully for the next, several months, it's going to be kind of a downtime in the apiary, but hopefully that will enable you to catch up on your homework and some of those other chores. So with that, I wanted to go through that fairly quickly, because I want to get to our timely topic, and our very own Dr. Brad Metz, who is a research associate postdoctoral researcher in our program. And I'm just going to end my show and stop my screening and turn it over to Brad to give us a topic, because he's an expert on honeybee pheromones. And this was a request from some of our viewers of the Apiculture Online to talk a little bit about pheromones. I get it that it's kind of the last one of the season, and it might not be as timely as, kind of in the spring, but nonetheless, I think it's really, really important and helpful. And I'll turn it over to Brad so that he can share his screen and kick us off on the timely topic of pheromones.
Sure, thanks, David. I suppose it's probably fairer to say at one time I was an expert in pheromones. I worry sometimes that my expertise has staled a little bit in the decade or so since I've been doing more or focusing more on other things. But, you never really leave behind your first love. And I think that's true for a lot of things in research, especially. So I try to do my best. But happily, since we've got Mark here, who also has this expertise, and I think a fair bit more recent than I. If we make it, he's going to be able to apply any number of updates and corrections to these things. The goal here, and what I'm trying to do with the Beekeeper's Guide, is to focus primarily on those pheromones that beekeepers have been interested in, and what that means is those things that have become products in some fashion. Now, it wouldn't be me, and if I didn't give you some kinds of definitions, and it's important to know that honeybees use a number of different kinds of signals to communicate to each other within the hive. We all know of the waggle dance. We view it primarily visually. They're viewing it probably more tactilely, but in any event, there are a number of different signal modalities or types of communication that's occurring here. With chemical communication, some of which is pheromones being the major one. And the idea here behind all communication, and pheromone communication in particular, is that you can impart an action on the receiver by sending out energetically cheap signal. So we have a couple of simple terms there for semiochemical, a chemical that has meaning to it. You can use any chemical in communication. This could be environmental. This could be produced. These could be non-specific. Pheromones in particular are those chemicals that are specifically produced to elicit a specific response in the receiver. So these are made in glands, and I've got here perhaps you can recognize this picture down here as a bee with the number of different glands that produce some of these exocrine or communicatory chemicals. So we classify pheromones in a couple of different ways. One, in how they move, there's of course a million shades of gray here, but the broad strokes here are volatile pheromones, depicted here by a nice little plumage of smoke. They're typically small molecules, low molecular weight. They're going to spread widely and dissipate quickly. You're going to find that these things are typically used for long-term or transient communications. And then you have your non-volatile pheromones. These are usually larger. They're going to spread over short distances only. In the case of queen pheromone, which we're going to come to a lot, and I'm sure many beekeepers are familiar with in some form, that headspace, or the amount that it will travel in air, is really only a few millimeters, so quite short. So that's largely a tactile pheromone. It's spread by contact, which sort of challenges our idea of olfaction, which we think of, as smell things in the air versus things like taste and, things in liquid and all of that. But with honeybees who are using their sensory organs differently and in concert, some of those sorts of gustation and olfaction there's some physical sense to it, but not in the same way that we would have. What are these chemicals? And I'm not going to get into details and bore you with a pile of naming strings, but they're typically things like alcohols, acids, aromatics, and esters. So anything that you in your daily life would smell is typically this kind of thing, and that's because they have an interesting shape. They have an interesting shape that your receptors can pick up and sense in an easy way, as apart from all of these other little things that might be very difficult to differentiate from each other. In honeybees in particular, any pheromone that we talk about is typically made up of multiple different components. At this point, I can say with some confidence that is the rule rather than the exception, although typically you will find that either through a research bias or discovery bias or stability, just how much we've looked at it, in the earlier literature, you will see this is the pheromone for X, right? This one thing. But like in the case of queen pheromone, we had 1, then we had 5, now we've got 9, and I think there's more that are coming from multiple places. So we go as we learn more, sometimes these become very clearly these complex blends of chemicals. And what these various blends are typically made up of are often molecular precursors, synergistic molecules, things like stabilizers and catalysts and stuff. And while you need the full blends of these pheromones to elicit the full effect, you can often get some kind of reduced, but maybe even useful effect with partial blends or even the primary components, which is where some of that confusion comes from. Now, the big one here is I've said the word effects a lot. So we classify pheromones by their effect. And we have 2 classifications here. We have releaser effects. These are short-term behavioral responses. Typically, they last only so long as the signal or the pheromone itself is present. Good examples of these are coming from queen signal again, are the licking and the grooming that the workers do to queens, or again, the same signal in a different context, the drone attraction to queens in flight. To contrast that, we also have primer effects, and much like primer, which is a preparatory thing, these are long-lasting effects, and they typically involve semi-permanent physiological changes. The repression of worker reproduction is a primer effect. The timing of the age at which they perform different tasks, how they progress through that sort of aging trajectory from different behaviors is a primer effect, and how that is modified by different chemicals or different pheromones in the honeybee environment. Now, as you can see here in the queen signal, illustrates very, 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 very nicely, is that the same pheromone can produce different effects under different conditions and in different individuals. And this, again, is the rule rather than the exception. And when you think about, we often use the term language. Honeybees have a dance language, they have a chemical language. One of the factors of a language, right, is contextual fluidity. The same word can mean different things or have different connotations when you're talking to different people or in different situations. This is hardwired behavioral things, but there is an analogy there. Now, to kind of bring home this idea of what a primer effect does, we can talk about very, very briefly the idea of response thresholds. where different individuals may be more likely to respond to a given dose of pheromone or to a given dose of anything. And I have here depicted the pile of dirty dishes, which hopefully everyone immediately recognizes. And some of you will say, oh, well, that's fine, we'll just do them later. And some of you, this will make your skin crawl because you have a different threshold of response to doing the dishes. And if you've ever had to live with a bunch of people, you will know that one person typically is either more angry about it or is doing the dishes all the time. Now, different individuals are going to have different likelihoods to respond or thresholds of response to a given dose of pheromone, different environmental conditions, and therefore will do different tasks. This is based on sort of a combination of genetics, rearing, environmental history, and context, and all of these things that we don't necessarily need to get into right now. But the important thing is some of these primer effects that we're talking about of a pheromone will change response thresholds to release or effects. So these pheromones will tune each other and tune individuals to respond not only to different environmental conditions, but to subsequent signals from other pheromones. So this process gets very complex very quickly and involves all of the pheromones we will talk today happening in different periods and different intensities throughout the bee's life. And this is how the entire colony ends up organized. So where a beekeeper comes in is how do you make use of this? Our job is in some ways to co-opt these communications as a tool to improve honeybee colony health and improve pollination efficiency. Now, you can also use it to wear bees, which I guess is a thing. Anyway, I have a pontification that maybe we can use as a point of argument later. And the idea here is there's ambiguity over whether the honeybees are domesticated, right? Or they're certainly not tamed in the same way we might think, or maybe but again, these terms as applied to bees are a little iffy. And I suspect that some of the reason why there's such ambiguity there is because we cannot communicate or manipulate the communication of the honeybee nearly as directly or as adroitly as we can, say, a dog or even cattle. So anyway, just a thought to think about moving forward. So with that brief primer on what chemical communication is and how it can work, let's talk about some of our apicultural attempts to do this. And I'm going to claim as this is a story of mixed successes, and we can, again, argue that moving forward. But I'll give you one that is absolutely an unabashed success, and that is smoke. So some of the oldest drawings that humans have made have been of honey hunters smoking trees and smoking colonies before going to collect, because we know that that changes their specific behaviors to defense, and it can make it much easier to interact with colonies and bees. So what this is doing is physically interfering with their olfactory process. It's clogging up their receptors and their membranes, and therefore pheromone detection. This acts as a pacifying and confusing effect. This can also induce engorgement behavior and feeding behavior in the colony. They might, where there's smoke, there is often fire, and we can use that to make a colony think there might be a reason to leave, and they will therefore eat. Now, it is important to note that this is not universally effective. And in fact, in those populations of bees that have been around humans and human activities the absolute longest, i.e. African populations and their daughters here in the New World, the Africanized bees, that smoking can have somewhat less of a, well, shall we say, attenuated and unpredictable responses. Now, mainly what smoke is used for here is to disrupt the release of responses to alarm and stinging pheromones. So this early attempt we found and we will continue to use, and there is no argument about its success. Far more recently are all of these other ones. I have a little picture of a bee with her abdomen in the air, fanning over that, sending out a very volatile pheromone, citral, sort of, I guess, probably by the name, a citrusy smelling scent. But spreading that in the air, and we often use it as, and it is often sold as swarm trap lures. It has been found as attractants from bees to feeders during training exercises and lab studies, as an idea to perhaps supplement the fact that sugars don't tend to have a lot of scent, which is one reason why often you'll find beekeepers talking about adding some kind of scent to their feeds. And there's a lot of different products here, but and I would say, although I've never personally used these, this seems to be one that, based on the number of different products, must have some level of success in the industry. Queen pheromone I've brought up a number of occasions. Here's a nice little picture of Apis florea. They are a little Asian honeybee that I think is particularly adorable. And here's a little retinue response there that you can see. It's sort of classic. Other species of honeybee also do this and will surround and lick the queen while she's on her thing. Now, queen pheromone, like I said, I've got 9 components here. There's 4 that come out of the mandibular gland. That is right up here. Well, that's the drone, but right up here. And then 5 additional components from multiple sources, currently in my sort of canonical understanding of queen pheromone. Like I said, these are acids and aromatic alcohols. They have a mixture of sort of non-volatile and volatile, somewhat contextually and somewhat based on like small changes in the components. This has a wide number of primer and releaser effects, with the main overall gestalt function to signal the presence of the queen. Now, what does that mean? Well, primarily that means suppressing queen rearing, inhibiting worker anarchy or their own reproduction, and then regulating foraging and development. I must apologize because I suspect my son is playing piano, so if that's coming through, enjoy. Now, we also have that this works as, or at least some components do work as, a mating pheromone, which is why we've got the drone and queen in flight over here. And the blend and the type of or the sort of the flavor, shall we say, the relative proportions of the various components change throughout the queen's life. And one of those biggest changes is a change from being a virgin queen to being a mated queen, with the virgin blend being distinct and attractive to drones. So we use this in beekeeping. The big reason that we use this in beekeeping is to prevent the queenless state of the colony. Now, very recently, I learned about how tight this timing is, but it's always been well known that bees will recognize that a queen is missing fairly quickly. This can be colony-wide as quick as 50 minutes, and this is based on a change in the response to other queens. Over several days, we will see the ovary development of the workers and worker egg laying beginning. And in our requeening methods, we tend to take advantage of this to minimize rejection, these sort of timings behind protecting the queen and removing the queen first and all of that. Now, synthetic QMP has been made commercially, right? One of the versions that I've purchased in the past has been temp queen here. And one possible way is to stabilize small packages for queen rearing or shipping, to delay swarming until you have, by providing more queen signal, to keep until you're able to buy more queens. In swarm traps along with Nasinoff, that feels kind of dubious to me, but is some listed effects. And I have this in my notes, and I've found this in the past. I have to look it up again, but sometimes sprayed as crop attractants, and this is something that I think is worth talking about when we get to later, as to what do these signals mean when they're taken out or when they're applied out of context. But these are the various uses, with the temp queen lures being the only ones that I think are still in production. So brood pheromones, and this is the thing that's near and dear to my heart. Credit to the USDA for their fine picture of brood here in little micro plates, because brood pheromones are what I did my PhD thesis on. And what I worked on was brood ester pheromone, and we're going with brood pheromones because I think we're separating these two at the moment. Brood ester pheromone is just a blend of 10 components. They're all fatty acid esters, kind of florally smelling typically. Although once you get up into the more unsaturated components, they start to smell like fish oil, which is sort of nasty. But anyway, this is a contact pheromone with low volatility. In fact, the headspace, or the amount, the distance it will tend to travel from the larvae, is approximately that of the width of its head to the top of the cell, which I think is very interesting. And this has, we claim that it has more primer and releaser effects than any other honeybee, or any other honeybee pheromone. And I took out the slide, but much like queen pheromone, the purpose of this is to signal the presence of the brood. It tunes all of the behavioral rates of workers, from foraging to performing nursing behaviors. Stay in the nest because there's more larvae that you need to take to. Leave the nest because there's enough larvae that you need to collect more pollen. So these things are tuned again with measurements and individual experiments experiences of the stores. Now we have volatile brood pheromone as well, which, as far as I know, is a single component. Mark has direct experience with this, so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. This is highly volatile and has a number of synergistic primer and releaser effects as well, performing some of the similar things as brood ester pheromone. Now, the really wonderful part about this, and I think one of the most exciting things, is that what you seem to find is that there's a sort of temporal switch between the volatile brood pheromone and the non-volatile brood pheromone that comes with larval age. And our volatile pheromone then seems to be more of a general feed me strategy signal, whereas the brood ester pheromone seems to be more about these late stage things, capping and regulating colony demography. So, well, again, and these are things that we can get into. Now, this was at one time used as super boost, because one of the main effects and one of the reasons, one of the things that brood pheromone was found to do was increase the feeding on pollen. So increase pollen foraging, increase pollen collection, increase the proportion of pollen foragers. This was individual and colony wide, so it's pretty big. And so the idea was we could use this to drive up drive the colony into a state where it would collect more protein nutrition and therefore rear more brood. They would grow bigger. They would make bigger colonies, survive the winter better. This was the idea. This is now a defunct product. There are I guess economic and sort of corporate reasons why, and IP reasons, and there's also the sort of core group of this that we can talk about in just a little bit. In that, despite all of its laboratory promise and all of its promise leading into product testing to the point where you see this thing, this was a mass-produced product. So it got all the way to that point and didn't realize the promise in a way that beekeepers found was worth spending the $2-3 at the pop it was. And that's something that we'll talk about as to why that comes in, because a good part of my research covers why that wasn't working. All right, other things that I think are coming down the pipeline. These are things that have not become products yet, but there are patents on the books for both of these. And these are oleic acid and tritriacontine. These are sort of death pheromones and hygienic cues. And they're both trying to kind of used in the same idea with the intent of improving and specifying the response to ill and parasitized brood or pupae. So one of the main tests that we use for hygienic behavior, and maybe some of you are breeding for or measuring hygienicity in your bees, is the freeze kill, right? You're chilling your brood and then they're dying. That's great, but there's sort of a non-specific cue there because they're dead. You don't know what they're died of. You don't know why they're dead. So when you breed to that, you're breeding to a non-specific signal. That some of this in particular, what people are often looking for are cues specific to mite parasitization that can then be trained towards, so that your error rate is not towards anything that's remotely stressed, but rather to a very specific cue. So there you go. And so whether or not these become products, I do not know. All I know is that they are in that chain. So then we
Brad,
have.
Sorry, Brad. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I do want to move on, and we have some questions here to your thing, which I think would be a good segue to introduce our guest here. And that is, do beekeepers have to buy these products in order to use the pheromones? I think that's something that's really important. Do they have to use these things or just understand
Oh,
how they function within colonies.
well, there's both. I mean, I can give you a direct example with regard to queen pheromone, where I mean, there's plenty of people who reserve queens either in alcohol or not in order to do these very things that these products are used for. And certainly understanding how, in particular, how queen pheromone works and how brood pheromone works is incredibly helpful towards keeping your colonies functioning, right? And a lot of times beekeepers will do this for sure within queen ring and otherwise without, when they're introducing queens and they're requeening and they're moving brood around to ensure that no colony stays broodless when it's not supposed to be, no colony stays queenless when it's not supposed to be. I think with things like Nasinoff and swarm catch, you're almost going to have to either fake it or use a product if you're going to try to attract bees to a particular nest. But you can also do the very thing that we've done forever, which is pick those elements that bees are most likely to choose. It's to some extent, it's down to what you want, like how you want to tune, what levers you want to pull. So I think the reason why I was focusing,
it's just reassuring, right, that not all beekeepers need to use this stuff every time, but knowing about them can really help
I think my point was more that these are the things that were closing in on industry level effectiveness to the point where there was money to be made. I may be taking the economist's approach to this, with the idea that nobody's going to buy a product that doesn't do anything, and there's some value in the idea that some of these things, your smoke, your queen pheromones, these things have been around for a very long time and used in a lot of different contexts. Now, when you get down to how subtle do you want to place the interplay between one pheromone and the other?
Right. Well, let's bring our guest into this conversation here, because Mark Carroll at the USDA in Tucson, Arizona, has done a lot of research in this and many other things. And let's just kind of kick it over to you, Mark. First of all, welcome to Apiculture Online. And do you have any comments on kind of what Brad was saying there about understanding the fundamental principles of the pheromones and then bringing it to market?
It's very good having Brad, explain these things, because these are things near and dear to my heart about this, and a lot of the attitudes and the problems in applications that he's talking about there. These are the things that I've gone through trying to figure it out and stuff like that as we go along. And we've been comparing notes. We've both had our successes and things that didn't quite work out, trying to manipulate pheromones to our degree that we have there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think it's important for beekeepers to know what goes into some of that process. I didn't unfortunately get into the nitty gritty of how you go from patent to market, but that is a long and arduous thing that I think is a real crucible. Does every product that come out from a patent, is it always worth a damn? Worth it? No. But nevertheless, that's the crucible that we tend to go to and we tend to try to go through.
Oh yeah, and people, you want something that you can just put into the colony and get a certain effect, whether it's removing mites or pests or treating disease or getting them to do something that's there. It's kind of one of the three approaches that you can, obviously we all want to know more about our bees. That's one thing. It's nice if we could have things at the far end that we can manipulate them specifically with that. That tends to be kind of a holy grail that's hard to realize for things we might talk about. Right. The third way that we're kind of looking at things here, and after bouncing around, is using the signaling that's going on there to tell us what actually is going wrong with the colony. Yeah. And maybe use that as a way of strategy of touching in lightly when we need to look at stressors and stuff, look at things that are very stereotypical or very associated, and saying likely points of failure or likely strong signals that are going there. The one thing I have to chuckle about is all these pheromones were worked out probably in very stable colonies, very large colonies, summer colonies, nice bees. Everything was perfect. But you know, when things are good, you're not necessarily, that's not the most interesting thing. You want to know when things are going wrong and when you need to be making your moves early on these things.
So I think that's actually an interesting point, Mark, and obviously that leads very well into your research into stressors and the sort of interplay between local cues of stress and a collective response. So in your research, what have you found in terms of how does a colony become aware of stress?
Well, the thing you got to think about, kind of zoom in to the individual for a second.
Sure.
Each individual is taking on things and getting all these cues as they can, but also giving off cues. You know, we certainly know as humans, we're not very good at smelling things, but you know, we certainly know when somebody's had a really stressful day, you know, like being nervous and stuff like that. They have different odors there and stuff like that. Now you do that with one individual, not much, you know, it's only going to be local and between the bees and stuff like that. If your whole colony is having starving or maybe having a disease hit it, or maybe something wrong with the queen, you're going to get much bigger amplification of that. We got thousands of likely cases of that. And that makes it easy to step in and kind of monitor what's going on. The goal here is to get things to where you can predict, you can find things predictably that are going wrong, associate them with, you know, the problems you have there, but also something that you can hopefully get early that's going on. I can think of two cases that we're doing with this that's pretty strong. One is those beta-ocimene, that volatile brood pheromone that you're looking at there. That's given off by a lot of things that are essentially a starvation signal that you can pick up on odor detecting equipment and stuff like that. And the thing that's good about it is it happens well before things go truly south. So we wouldn't necessarily have to go in and look at things there. It's very stereotypical, and it's also stereotypical in the response that it gives.
Right. Something
that's probably a little more direct with this too. I liked your thing about the hygienic behavior and looking at death odors. One of the things we're looking at, kind of getting in with some of the microbe stuff, is looking at very early onset disease odors, because things change as you go along. And if we can get bees that respond to those early stages, when the bee, you know, you're just coming down with American foul brood or chalk brood or something like that, and then take care of it before you have an infectious dead larva, long term, that would be a goal. But that kind of illustrates where you can take this knowledge and either use it to monitor things or like a tool to take it apart.
With the state of that idea of monitoring and manipulation, one of the things, and you see this with beekeepers when they talk about things like nestmate recognition and using different cues to like make it easier to introduce queens or introduce bees. But my understanding about that sort of template-based recognition is that there's not any like hardwired like certain signal. It's always a relative mix of environmental noise and incidental things. With regards to stress or disease, do you fall into that same idea where so much of it is like you may not be able to tune to any one thing necessarily, or are you finding are you often finding decent cues or repeatable?
Yeah, I would say just by the nature of what I do, you get into it, everybody wants the silver bullet with a certain threshold and say, you know, we got it. And well, it doesn't work that way. You know, it's like different individuals, you know, some of us are cleaning up after everything. Some of us are walking around like slobs, you know, need to take a shower and stuff like that. But you get enough individuals together, you have sort of an average, sort of a working average there that you can take there. And you do end up with situations where the colony is virtually screaming for a certain thing. Another thing that might be important is I have the feeling that we started out looking at individual things saying, okay, ocimene is the young larva signal. Yeah. Brood ester pheromone is this signal. If you go back and you take a broader look at things, you realize virtually every bee in the colony that's involved is signaling things.
Yeah, and I
might
feel
all have a
bad giving
say.
that pat story when we know that elements of brood pheromone are produced by foragers for other things, and there's these chemical motifs seem to be used over and over and over again by different individuals in different interactions, and that's kind of why I brought up the idea of a word being a different thing. And really, if we wanted to get right down to it, a curse word, because no words are more malleable and useful in more contexts than just a good swear.
I'll try to
But
withhold an
you
example
know,
here, but you know,
I know,
but I know exactly what you mean because we had these nice little pat stories, and that's not unusual in science. We find things and we stick with what we know. But then you start seeing things like queen pheromone-ish things that are produced by workers. And you start seeing, okay, that volatile brood pheromone also happens to be produced by queens and very young adult bees that are trying to signal to the colony, take care of me in a certain way. And these things change. Like a big paper we have coming out is looking at what do colonies signal with this starvation pheromone in drought versus normal times. Different life stages do different things. And if you think about what they're doing, it actually makes more sense. Like if the colony is going to pursue kind of conservative food strategies that are there. So, but it's, it's just a notion here that, we can take a look at this. We can know something about the queens. We can know something about brood rearing and also kind of what the colony is up to. But we can also know things about when things are going south, like starvation and disease from this. And it's taking a while, but we're building together the kind of gestalt aspect of that and trying to apply it to some really nice big problems that we have.
So that actually is a great segue and break for kind of our last segment, which is kind of the open Q&A. And so all of those who are on our YouTube channel, please go ahead and type any questions for Mark or Brad or just about this particular topic of pheromones, but anything in general as well. But there's already been some comments on there. And one of the comments was asking, and I'll direct this to you, Mark, that it's so complex. So like we kind of have a really good understanding about honeybee pheromones in general, but there's still so much that we don't know that it can almost be paralyzing about wanting to manipulate the colonies because we don't know exactly what we're doing. So is our kind of ignorance of a lot of these pheromone issues problematic for beekeepers, or should they have a little sense of relief with that?
Well, it does get back to the idea that humans are just not very good at doing, interacting on this wavelength as far as, being able to tell there. And it can be paralyzing. I look at, for example, starvation colonies produce about maybe close to 30 different volatiles that are, somewhat associated with that. The only way you figure these things out is by going out and trying them in different environments, different things. Hopefully you can pick something that works across the board in different situations. But that's what really nails us when it comes down to sure bets or things that have worked well in the lab or under these conditions. I had that experience with the mite attractants that I had. They work terrific in the lab. They work terrific at certain times in the year. And then you got to other times or slightly different things. Maybe when you want them most, and suddenly you're dropping from 90% efficacy down to 40 or 50.
Yeah.
And that's
And
just
certainly,
not good enough.
and certainly, 30 years ago, the brood pheromone that we're now talking about as a colony level social hormone, it was the same. It was studied as a mite attractant.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was designed to be or intended to be a part of a trap. So.
And I will say too, it's the old steak and hamburgers metaphor. It's very good to get things attract to hamburgers, in the lab. But when you have a lot of steak around, it doesn't always jazz them up. And, it would be different if with mites, for example, if we could get by killing half of them. When you got to kill 90% of them for it to really work. It's not such a good thing.
But to wrap that up and to underscore it, what you're talking about is trying to find, some sort of stressor chemicals or some sort of cue. This is stuff that us egghead scientists do, right? Like not beekeepers. but moving frames of open brood from one colony to another is by definition introducing more brood pheromone. They shouldn't be afraid of doing that because they don't perhaps know the ultimate consequences, right? Like,
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, the great thing about these pheromone systems that I'm finding, and I've been looking at queen pheromone, for example, and looking at under different stressors, how does that signal go up or down? And we find that in midwinter, in like say the Imperial Valley, where it's really warm, they're giving off pheromone levels that would kill, result in them being replaced in other times of years. Bees are quite flexible. I mean, flexible is the word to use for that kind of stuff when it comes to that. I would not worry about the practices we have as beekeepers.
Yeah.
And that.
Like,
Hopefully what we're going to get out of this, though, is a way of getting a little bit more universal, easy way to say, okay, what we're doing now is going to benefit them down the line. I think you guys were talking about overwintering and getting prepped for that in warm weather conditions potentially. We're doing that out. It's 90 something degrees out today, but we're doing that here. And our minds are on that. And our minds are on things like that you have too. Like, for example, I got to feed them in the fall, but is feeding them too much? Is that a bad thing? Yep. I like to make winter bees to make over that gap, but what does that do to the queen? Yep. You know, as far as that go? Or do I burn out my colony before I get to the spring? You know, we're getting a little more complicated about our questions there. Right. To put it mildly.
I think a little bit what you run into is when you are part of a beekeeping tradition and a group of people that have been beekeeping in an area for a long time, you already have a lot of right answers. Not all of them, sure.
Yeah.
But these are all generated from trial and error. The goal as a scientist, and when we talk about these pheromones and stuff, we want to know why these things are right. And whether, and specifically, then we can apply those answers to an unknown situation or a problem that a beekeeper hasn't solved yet through generations or generations of bees or generations of beekeepers. The goal would be to develop the next smoke before we had to spend a few thousand years working on it. You know,
exactly. You know, and it's true too that we're looking for universals as scientists because, you know, the more it works, the more it seems to be the right story. But, you know, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, you know, having it work at the local level for that condition, that's the true test. And, you know, your local knowledge of how it works in your area is like built on years of experience is so much, you know, we're coming in from the outside with some generalizations in some cases. So it's, you know, hopefully in the end, when we get these things and they seem to like give us a quick route, maybe to shortcut the process. You know, the only way we find out is by going out there and trying them in different areas. And that's sort of things that, like, for example, with the queen consortiums or the overwintering consortiums, we're trying to see how well it works under your conditions and under different conditions. Right. That's sort of the true value.
That's excellent. There's some other questions here. I'm sure I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but just try to get them as I see them. There's another question here for you, Mark, about, and I'm assuming it's some of the work that you're doing on trying to detect some of these stressor chemicals. What's the equipment that you're actually using for that? Again, not every beekeeper is going to be able to do that, but what's kind of the fancy equipment that you're using for that?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, the stuff I have is not going to really work for that, but it's material. At this end, it's material that can field trap, you know, volatiles and stuff like that. We're probably not looking for things that somebody would get and then send to us and say, hey, I smell this, what's wrong with my colony? It's not going to work like that. Right. But what we can do is they can tell us at the low end, because so much of what we do at the high with science is putting things in an extreme late form. And we want to get it at the beginning when it's not so much a problem. But things like, yeah, I have these big fancy equipments, these GCMSs and HPLCs and stuff like that. If it was ever to get out,
what are those? Say what those are. What they're
yeah, that's very good. Gas chromatography in HPLC. If you watch enough CSSI, which is a much more exciting program than what I do day to day, it would be those things they put on before they go out to the restaurant or the club and
Right.
come back and get a little graph that tells you with peaks how much you have of things.
But it doesn't tell you instantly, and kind of to follow the plot line, right? It's not.
Yeah, my
quite as
students
easy.
were disappointed that it wasn't like they could read it and go, "Oh, it's that." But so much of it is quantitative, and then we're trying to take the sea of things and filter it down to something very narrow.
Right.
Hopefully, at the end, keep it simple, keep it quick.
Right.
It's not going to be useful if you have to use the equipment I have.
Yep. No, that's exactly. Well, working towards, again, these are years, decades even to get that working. That's why we need to do the work in the first place, right? Here's another question, actually, and I'll kick this one over to Brad because he was the one that brought it up about Temp Queen, which I believe was the QMP that you can have. There's a question here about if that can help deter the swarming impulse in the spring. That's a really excellent question. So
the answer to that question is yes, for a time. And I'm not going to give you that time as in a matter of very long. When we have done that and when we've trialed that, it's a matter of days. You're not going to get a lot of use out. Probably enough time to order a queen, which is or manage your splits. It's like you throw them in there. In my research, I mostly use them to stabilize things for shipping. That's and again, those are that's acting for a few days. Now remember, that Temp Queen only has some of the ingredients that go into a full queen signal, so it's not gonna last forever, but it will help in those situations. Yes.
Oh, great. Mark, any further comment on that?
I would say, yeah. I mean, those signals are almost invaluable in that sense. It would be a question of, my thing is like a lot of the things that we're trying to do, you get by with wise management, as far as that, using your noggin with that and the things there. But with specialty things like, for example, shipping queens, that's an area of fairly heavy research right now. If we can get queens in that are just doing better than they are, you don't want to blame it on the UPS guy leaving it out in the sun for a day or something like that.
Yeah, Mark, you raise a really good point. I think I may have made a mistake in writing this talk and making it sound like I advocate strong use of chemistry in your beekeeping. The best beekeeping is good beekeeping, and then you won't need these things for everyday use. When you get to these finely tuned things like Mark's talking about and some of the stuff that we do with, then those are going to happen. But certainly Temp Queen's products have been marketed to limit swarming in emergencies like that scenario.
Oh, yeah. And that stuff, it could, things of that line could bridge the gap rather quickly and nicely with that.
Yeah.
Right.
I should mention
but
too,
very
that
temporarily.
Temporarily. Don't leave them in 3 weeks and expect it to hold. But
So
a lot of the things that we're trying to get at are things where we're using these are things that are very long term, are very, like, do I feed in September for better outcomes in February in almonds or something like that?
Yeah.
No,
that's
kind of
great.
beyond my perspective.
That actually, it kind of is a perfect segue to I'll try and sneak in one last question here. And this is kind of for anybody here on the Zoom panel who wants to chime in. And it kind of gets to your point, Mark. You're saying that it's 96 degrees in Tucson today. It's been warm here in North Carolina and the Southeast in general, just for the last couple of weeks. And there were some comments on the YouTube saying that the colonies are still pretty broody. Is that a problem that they still have brood as they're going into winter? And I know that there's no right or wrong answer to that, but what do you think about colonies having? Is there too much brood at this time of year? Is there such a thing?
That's the $64,000 question, because we look at colonies in December in the warmer parts, Southern California, going to almonds, things like that. And, the usual things, hey, they're making brood. Hey, they're flying. These are good things. Maybe not. Maybe it'd be good to have a little time off. I would think about the folks that are going the cold storage routes. One of the big things in the southern tier is right now is to try to deliberately put your colonies through a longer extended winter period. Some of the evidence is that that actually works in some conditions for beekeepers. They sustain much fewer losses.
Right, right. Lewis, do you have a comment on that?
I just wanted to mention that, and from my perspective, there are a lot of moving parts in that broodiness question as far as colonies having a lot of brood this time of year. It really depends on the what version of bee you have and what kind of beekeeping you're doing. Are you feeding heavy and stimulating that? So I have beekeepers calling and saying, I don't think I have a queen. They've really shut down. Other colonies still have 3 frames of brood. And so there's a lot of moving parts in that.
You bet. And it's not necessarily a bad thing of having lots of brood. I guess one of the risks is that if it gets too cold, that the brood cannot stay warm, and that can introduce disease problems. But the upside is that they can, kind of continue to hatch out and stay populous. And yeah, so it all depends. There is no kind of right or wrong answer, I think, to that.
Yeah. Right. It's complicated.
It is.
Yep.
Well, unfortunately, everyone, I'm sorry, we're going to have to end it there. We just ran out of time very, very quickly. I just really, really enjoyed the discussion. I want to thank everybody on the panel, especially the North Carolina Department of Agriculture apiary inspectors, who've been very, very generous with their time in joining the apiculture online webinars every other week that we've been doing this year. Want to thank our special guest, Mark Carroll. Again, thank you for your expertise and wonderful discussion. Great job, Brad, on the primer of honeybee pheromones. We're not going to have these apiculture onlines for the next several weeks, but stay tuned if we're going to continue these in the spring and when we're going to kick that off. And in the meantime, hope everybody's colonies do well over winter and you come out with very, very low winter losses. Until then, take care.